thank you for being with us, Scott. We really appreciate it. You're in the airport, so I know it's a little bit of a difficulty for you, but we really appreciate you joining with us today. And we look forward to hearing everything you have to say.
I appreciate that, and a little bit of craziness. I do hope that the noise here, the ambient noise of the airport, doesn't disrupt the conversation.
No, not at all. We should be good. So thank you so much for that. But to just kind of kick it off, I want to welcome everyone back. This is our third GPS luncheon of this series. And I take it everyone survived. It's the first one post-election, so I'm glad to see everybody's face. And as always, we want to start with a few housekeeping items. So for those of you who are regulars, welcome back. For those of you who are new, we appreciate you having us, and we hope you consider joining GPS. We host these monthly luncheons every second Wednesday of the month, and we bring in amazing guests to come and talk about policy areas across that are just interesting and happening across the country. Usually it's in person, but this series has started off in quarantine, and so far we are still in quarantine. So hopefully we'll be back in person soon. Everyone's going to start off muted through the duration of the call. And if you have questions throughout the conversation, you can pop them in the chat box over to the right. Towards the end of the call, we'll unmute folks and allow you to ask your question directly if you want. If you don't want, we'll work it into if you don't want to do that, we'll work it into the conversation throughout the course of the conversation. But we'll try to get to every question we can. And so we've had a few people tell us that they haven't received the event invites prior to today. So if you haven't and you're already on the newsletter list, what may be happening is it could be going to spam. So you want to go into your email and go to events@goodpolicysociety.com and try to mark that email address as a friendly email address so it doesn't get caught up in spam. And if you still have issues, myself, Annie, or Kate can kind of help you and make sure that you stay abreast of all of the ongoing events with GPS. So last month, I know we proposed that we were going to be back in person. Obviously, that hasn't happened yet, but we're still looking forward to doing that. But in the meantime, being virtual means that we get to have really amazing guests from all over the country join in and, provide us their insight. And so today's guest is Scott Rasmussen. So we're really excited to talk to him. And I'm sure most of you know who he is, but just in case you don't, we're going to go through his background a bit just to give you a little bit of an overview. So Scott is an American public opinion pollster and political analyst, and he produces the ScottRasmussen.com daily tracking poll, which is an ongoing gauge of American voters' political sentiment. Scott also is the editor-at-large for Ballotpedia, which is a website that I love, and especially because I'm a local guy, I love looking at the mayoral and major city information that they have on there about the local elections. So I would suggest you check that website out if you have not, and he produces the Number of the Day feature for them. And he was also the founder of Rasmussen Reports, where he served as pollster and president for 10 years until leaving the company in 2013. Earlier in his professional life, Rasmussen co-founded a little-known sports network station called ESPN, which I did not know until I was reading his bio, and I thought that's really cool. After leaving Rasmussen Reports, he founded Rasmussen Media Group, which working as a political analyst, author, public speaker, and columnist. So again, Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate you. And so just want to kind of turn it over to you for a bit to just say hello to the group, give us a little bit of your background, and just let us know what's been going on with you this past week, really.
Well, this last week, what's been going on is pretty straightforward. I thought by the time we had this conversation, life would be easy, the election would be over, we'd be doing our post-election wrap-up, and obviously that hasn't happened. It's a situation where the numbers are changing every day, and where there's another little election coming up in Georgia that will have an impact on what we all think. But in the broader sense, one of the things that happened a couple weeks ago, heading into the election, I write a weekly column for the Deseret News, and I wrote a column that I guess it achieved everything you want to as a columnist. It provoked a lot of reaction, most of it not good, but the anger came from both the left and the right. And what I had the nerve to suggest was that America would be okay regardless of whether Joe Biden wins the presidency or Donald Trump was reelected. And I said this because my belief always has been that the culture leads, and we overrate the impact of politicians. It's not that they don't matter. It's not that politics don't matter. Obviously, there will be different policies with a Biden administration than a Trump administration. But longer term, it is things that happen in the general society that have a bigger impact on the world that we live in. And I give examples in my talks all the time about this is the way it's always been in America. Thomas Jefferson didn't inspire Americans to revolt by writing the Declaration of Independence. That didn't get written until 15 months after the fighting began, and almost all of the British governors had been forced out of the colonies. What was very important about that was a statement that gave voice to what was going on, that put it in form that we can identify with today, but we mistake it if we think that was a political system leading. So anyhow, I wrote this column and I got enormous pushback because basically people on one side said if Donald Trump is reelected, America is over. And on the other side, they said if Joe Biden wins and those socialists come in, America is over. And so I went out and did a poll and found out 31% of voters, just 31% agreed with the idea that America will be okay no matter what happens in this election. And that's a topic I really like talking about. I'm very pessimistic about our political system. I believe it is badly broken. Just watch the way they're counting votes right now, and anybody would have that same sense. But I believe America's future is very bright.
Yeah, it was an awesome message to start off with. So, I'm really interested because I was going through your recent polls, and one of them said that 13% of registered voters discuss politics daily. And 27% rarely or never do, but 41% discuss it less than once a week. So I'm curious how we're at this point where it's so polarized, and yet you hear politics. I mean, I think largely the folks on this conversation, maybe it's because of who we surround ourselves with. We hear about politics a lot, but yet so many Americans don't actually talk about it that much. There seems to be a major disconnect there.
There is, and I'll throw one more statistic in that always shocks people like those who are probably on this call. 26% of voters, 1 out of 4 voters, don't think things would be much different in the country if Hillary Clinton had won 4 years ago. I mean, that's a staggering number for political activists to wrestle with. Now, again, it's not that they're saying nothing would have changed, but they don't see the impact the way people who live and breathe politics do. Part of this divide is that is a gap between different segments of society. You know, we've heard a lot in recent days about white voters without a college education. They seem to be in a different world than the political elites. And part of it is they don't see politics as having, that direct a connection on their life. And so this is something that we'll be talking a lot about. But when you have a discussion about what's going on in the political world, probably everybody on this call, you're informed of what was said yesterday and what happened here and there. A lot of people aren't focused on that. Back several years ago, one of my favorite things used to be I'd get a call from somebody saying, what do people think of the president's speech last night? And I would always say, well, most people don't know the president gave a speech last night. And we have to factor that in. Something else that grows out of this is the words that we use in the political world don't have the same meaning in popular culture. And I'll give 2 quick examples of that. First, a lot of polling gets done on the topic of should Roe v. Wade be overturned? And it almost always shows most people don't really want to overturn it. But we also went out and asked, do you know what would happen if Roe v. Wade was overturned? It turns out that 56% of voters do not know what that would mean. They either don't have any idea or they think what they think would happen is incorrect. So if you ask a polling question about Roe v. Wade, what does it really mean when people don't know the impact? And the other example, and I guess it's relevant because of so much recent rhetoric in this campaign, a lot of polling out showing that about 1/3 of Americans have a favorable opinion of the term socialism. And among younger voters, it's closer to 50%. Well, that's great. when you ask people what socialism means, it's not what people in Washington or people in political circles think it means. Among people who say they like socialism, 80% say they like free markets. And only 1 out of 3 people who like socialism say that that means higher taxes and more centralized political power. To them, it kind of means more power closer to home, more community governance. That's sort of the pop culture meaning of the term. So again, we have to be really careful when we talk about national political moods in the language of the political circle that we're in. And that stat you started this with, that only about 13% are talking politics every day. That's something everybody on this call should keep in mind.
Yeah. So it seems as though there's kind of an education gap, and not a formal education gap, but just an education in terms of the terms that they're using when they're polling and the issues that they're talking about. So do you think that's why polling, and I know you recently wrote about this, about needing to kind of take a second look at the polling industry, is that why it's so off? Because people are getting asked questions that they don't truly know the answer to or don't know the context of?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of issues in polling. Obviously, there's been a lot of challenges this year because of the way the election turned out. And I'll be writing a lot more about this. What was interesting to me watching the election night coverage was nothing happened. I mean, Florida was a little bit of a surprise. That was the surprise from the data, but nothing else happened on election night that was out of my range of expectations. I had told people going in that the best outcome for Republicans was a narrow win for Donald Trump following weeks of recounts. They could probably hold the Senate, and the best outcome for Democrats was a moderate Biden victory, a modest Biden victory. But there was such shock to it, and one of the reasons is some of the polling averages, the national averages, were way off. They were high, they were expecting and talking about a higher Biden victory. And then there were some state polling challenges in a very significant way. One of the things I have suggested is we should not do state polls in the final 2 weeks of an election. It's not the right tool for that job. As for the national polls, I think part of the problem is that the pundits, the old school pundits, the people that have been doing this since the 70s and 80s and 90s when elections used to be different, they have been saying things like, well, the best polls are the ones that are where you have somebody pick up a phone and call. I call those operator assisted polls. They performed worse than all the other polls this year. But a lot of the pundits in New York and Washington said, well, those are the ones we pay most attention to. And they discounted polls like mine that showed a tighter race.
So kind of the last thing on polling, I got this question sent from Aaron Saikon, and he said that he's heard a lot in the media talk about the difference between the way that, people on the right and people on the left answer questions. Some are more honest than others. Is that something that you find in your polling? And also, is it something that you found just kind of generally throughout the course of this cycle? Do polling groups see that as an issue the same way that the media has reported?
That's an enormous discussion that we don't know a final answer to yet. My gut and most of the data that I've seen suggest that the shy Trump voter phenomenon probably accounts for maybe 1% or 2% difference between the president's support in reality and support in the polls. There are a lot of, our polling showed that about 15% of Trump voters said that their family and friends didn't know who they voted for. But the number was about the same for Biden. The biggest reason that people gave is because they think voting is a private matter. The next biggest reason is because they hang out with people that don't talk politics. Next biggest reason was I didn't decide myself until the last minute. Now there was a gap. 12% of Trump voters who said that their family and friends didn't know said they were afraid of how people would react. Only 5% of Biden supporters were. So again, there's a little bit of that. I think the bigger problem, it's not so much that they answer questions differently. I think there's two issues that are going on here that interact. One, if you just do a poll, random sample, you will get way too many people with a postgraduate degree, way too many college graduates, way too many women, and now in the internet area, way too many young people. there are some groups that are conspicuously underrepresented there. So one of the things that I did a lot this cycle was try to reach out to, to white voters without a college education. I wanted to make sure I got a big enough sample to make sure we captured that view, because it is a different view of the world. In the old days of phone polling, what you would do, we knew people in urban areas didn't answer the phone as much. They were more likely to be out. So you just place more calls there. And conceptually, that's what we do today. Now, the second thing that comes into this is there is different terminology that right and left use. And there are different things that people see as code words or signals. And if you throw those in, yeah, you can get a different response from Republicans or Democrats. But again, I think that's a smaller part of the problem. The biggest issue is you have to work really hard in today's world to get a good sample. You have to get people comfortable with the fact that you're an honest poll. You're not some campaign trying to milk information from them, and then go from there.
Interesting. So you mentioned today, and then I've read your writing before where you talked about people being more politically polarized than we are as a society. And I kind of want to hear more about that, because I think, we had a pre-call and you mentioned that as well, and how outside of politics, people of different political persuasions can work very well together in most instances. And so I kind of want to hear more about that and how as a society we get to that place. I mean, because there has been such an emphasis placed on politics, not even just recently, but in recent years, and it's just kind of continuing to increase, and I think it's going to continue to increase.
Well, I would certainly say you're right. It is going to continue to increase. For me, this came about, I was slow to figure this out. I got very discouraged about the political process and couldn't see a way out. I thought our political system was broken and what was going on. And yet things in America seem to be going okay for a long time. And you're sort of like, why is this disconnect? And it began, I actually gave an example in my last book of my family and I did a church service group. This is a long time ago when my kids were very young. And we were given this task of sorting through some yams in the back of an 18-wheeler that was surplus food. And we had to sort what was good and what wasn't good. And it was a hot North Carolina day. And you can just imagine the aroma. It got pretty fragrant in there. And we were there for hours and hours. And we're looking at this stack of yams, and we weren't even making a dent into it. But then when we turned around and we saw the pile of food that we had cleared that would benefit people who needed to have that food, it was like, wow, we've done a lot of good. And pretty soon everybody in our group turned and was facing the way we saw what was happening. We were seeing where the positive things were. And for me, that was the message. We can look at Washington and see all the problems, but if you look out in society, you see what millennials are doing, you see what different groups are doing to find ways to work together. There's a lot to be hopeful about. And in that, I include charitable groups, social activists, community groups, entrepreneurs. People are solving problems in ways that we never could have imagined before. And when you do that in the outside of the political atmosphere, it's not, the first question isn't, are you a Republican or a Democrat? What you find out is when people begin to work together in community, they can work together across those lines. And, we see that after storms. The communities that recover fast from hurricanes are communities that had a strong social fabric, because it's not the government's responsibility, or the government doesn't have the capability to rebuild things. You have to rely on family, friends, and churches and local businesses. So that idea of working together seems to be very important to most people. They recognize it, but we never say it's as important as politics. And I'll give one very specific polling example of this. If we talk about politics, racial politics are incredibly divisive. They have been for a very long time. And voting is very strong along racial lines. But when we ask people, in your day-to-day life, do people get along pretty well across racial lines and working together? And we begin to explore that. Overwhelmingly, people say yes. When we're working on community projects, there are things that bring a more diverse group together. And yes, we work together well. So when you put it in the political context and you begin to fight over certain things, it becomes polarizing. And the reason for that is politics is about power and money. It is about finding ways to get your side a little bit more influence to implement your vision of how to succeed. Most of the time in community projects, you're just trying to figure out how to work things better.
Yeah. And you would think that during this time when there is such a need for, I mean, you see food drives going on left and right, rental relief efforts and all these things, that we should be increasingly relying on the social fabric rather than focusing on the political fabric. But it just doesn't seem that's happened.
No, not even close. And, just on the humorous side, to give you a sense of when you get into politics, how divisive it is, 50% of Republicans, half of all Republicans, believe pollsters did a lousy job this last election. Only 13% of Democrats agree. So even on the rating of polls, the minute you put it into the political context, people learn what their team is supposed to say, and then they say it. Yeah. So it's frustrating.
Yeah. So you mentioned, looking outside of DC, and something else that you've written about in the past is that when you look at a lot of the monumental changes we've seen in our country, from the civil rights movement to other major political movements, they've all started in communities and cities, towns, counties across this country. Obviously that's still happening, but can you just speak more to that and speak more to kind of maybe what we're going to see moving forward? Because a lot of these movements are still starting whether you know the defund the police movement or anything else, they're still starting outside in America rather than in the Beltway.
Yeah. From the good news from my perspective is 2 out of 3 people say that, believe that almost all positive change begins outside of Washington, but that is our history. Women did not get the right to vote in 1920 when Congress sent out an amendment and it got ratified. The first women to vote, the first women to get the vote after America was founded were in Wyoming in 1869. And the reason women got the right to vote in Wyoming had nothing to do with politics. It's that there were 6 guys for every girl in Wyoming, and they wanted to bring women out there. And they said, give them political rights. What's the harm? And it sounds silly, but it was a marketing campaign. It was a marketing campaign to get women to move to Wyoming. In fact, it was so blatant that some of the suffragettes said they didn't want it to pass because the motives weren't pure. Well, over time, over 50 years, more and more states adopted. They were competing with Wyoming. They began to pass it. And sometimes women got the right to vote in local elections, sometimes state elections. It interacted with a lot of other issues. A big one was the temperance issue. The liquor industry was against letting women vote because they thought they would want to ban liquor sales. By the time Congress got around to acting, by the time Congress passed the amendment that we now know of as giving women suffrage, there were 2 really significant factors. One, a woman was already serving in Congress. She came from North Dakota. Her state, Jeanette Rankin State, let women vote, so therefore she was eligible to serve in Congress, and she got elected. The second significant thing is, by the time Congress voted on this, half of Congress was already being elected with the votes of women. So, it was in their own self-interest to move this forward. That change began totally outside the political system. The civil rights movement, everything that you read about what Martin Luther King did and the nonviolent movement was talking about bringing pressure to bear outside of the political process first to draw a spotlight on what was going on. And this happens time and time again on issue after issue. The 401ks that so many Americans enjoy today were a mistake. Congress never meant that to happen. Congress passed a very minor tax bill in the late 70s. They listed in their summary 24 things about it. Nothing about private retirement plans. A guy named Ted Benna was a benefits consultant in the Philadelphia area, and he did something really bizarre. He read the bill, and he found this paragraph 401k that seemed to say exactly what we think it means. And we know from the history that wasn't the intent, but he began selling that. And it was because of Ted Benna and pushing it that we had this change. So Congress did something an independent operator looked at it and saw how to use it to benefit his clients, and we had change. That's what I mean by this change taking place outside of the political process. And again, I think elections are really important. I think policy is important to discuss. I think having these things, but we make a mistake if we believe that the only way to solve problems, the only way to work together is through the political process. That is usually the least effective way to get something done.
Mm-hmm. Is a part of this that, it seems by and large, the citizenry has forgot that we set the agenda rather than certainly DC elected officials, but even local elected officials. It seems that we've kind of just defaulted and allowed them to set the agenda when that shouldn't be the case. Is that a part of this? And how do we scale that back? I mean, obviously you can spend hours talking about that.
Well, I think it's absolutely true that citizens have, I won't say abdicated, but have really forgotten their role and should get more engaged. But I think it's also a mistake in that when we talk about governing society, it is not only our formal governing processes that do that. It is the informal relationships that we have that govern society, which means we all have a role. We all have a responsibility to play in that. One of the ways I explain that is my wife plays a role in governing my life. That's the way it should be, and I play a role in governing hers. When you have relationships with people, you do begin to set standards, and that's true for employers. It's true for everybody. And so every institution in America, every organization has a role to play in governing the society at large. And so the first thing we need to do is to recognize that and be responsible for it, recognize it's more than politics. And also, think about what does that mean in terms of how we approach a problem. The issue for America is how do we solve the many problems before us? And let's figure this out, not relying solely on the political process.
I think some of that, it seems as though as civics education has changed, that has changed. And Nick Lamson put a question here that I want to read. It says, curriculum on civics education was changed in Texas in the late 1980s. Since then, political dialogue has deteriorated. Is there any effort to change this in our public schools? Could that be a help creating greater civility and a search for common ground?
I don't know about the specifics of what happened in Texas, so I can't comment on that, but that's a common theme around the country. And yes, I believe civics education our society has suffered because we have not talked enough about that. I think the broader problem in that regard, though, is sometimes our civics education gets stuck in, there was this great document written in 1787, and here's what the Hamilton plan was, and here's what the Madison plan was, and here's why these amendments made sense at that time. We don't talk enough because our founding was a part of a particular era and moment in time. Absolutely true. The people who wrote those documents spent a lot of time thinking about broader lessons of politics, and they were trying to apply that to their particular situation. If you want to restore some of that civic trust, I think what we need to do is learn to talk about topics like freedom and equality and self-governance and checks and balances in ways that are relevant in the 21st century, because we just don't have that.
And I want to continue on that, but I also want to, because I feel like we're probably gonna have a lot of questions. I do want to start opening it up for questions. So if we can unmute, or if you want to pop your question in the side, we can start taking those. And I lost the question that I had that was on the tip of my tongue about what you were just saying. So I can't. Hopefully it comes back to me. Hopefully it comes
okay.
Back.
Well, and I do think one of the things that I note is, when I start talking about some of the challenges, it's really easy to put down younger generations. It's really easy to say the kids aren't paying attention in school, or the schools aren't teaching them. And I pretty much remember my grandparents saying that about baby boomers. The world isn't the way it is when we grew up. That doesn't mean it's worse now by any stretch of the imagination. And we have to recognize that people grow up with different experiences. But if you have principles that you want to convey to people, you need to put it in terms that they understand. You don't need to, that meant the example I gave earlier about socialism. The objective is not to teach people what socialism meant historically. If somebody says they like socialism, there's probably a lot of common ground with you if you believe in free markets. Why not recognize that and build on it? And that's part of the challenge.
Okay. Now that you said that, my question came back to me. So, when we asked that question from Aaron before, you said that a lot of the polling is about people using terminology that might not resonate with that person. And so, do you think that that is a significant contribute to the divide currently? That kind of, conservatives are using terminology that doesn't resonate with liberals, whether we're talking about civil rights or whatever the case is, and vice versa, they're using terminology that doesn't resonate with conservatives. Is it kind of this mismatch that we keep seeing? And how do we get on the same page? Is there a way to get on the same page?
Well, yeah, it's absolutely true that there is different language and different things used to describe it. And it's absolutely horrible when you do polling. I do a lot of polling about sort of deeper attitudes to find out what people are thinking. And when I explore what Democrats, especially progressive Democrats who would say they're part of the resistance or something, their attitudes about Republicans are really seeing Republicans as evil. And then when I look at what the really conservative base who support Donald Trump, no matter what, and you get into this deep, deep conservative base and you ask them what they think about Democrats, it's just as repulsive. So there are two extreme sides who don't see anything good or redeeming in the other side. Part of it is language. Part of it is the political process itself. But we do need to find ways to build on that. And look, it's not all the political process. When I grew up, there were 3 television networks. They had 94% of the primetime audience. We all watched the same TV shows. We all got news from one of 3 networks and one local newspaper. There was a common ground of information. In the diverse media world we have today, there is no common ground to start with. We have to build it.
Charles, could I ask a question on that?
Go for it, Daniel. Go ahead.
So Scott, definitely makes sense that it would undermine the civil discourse that we don't perceive a sort of common ground or a common arbiter. But at the same time, if that common ground is biased to one side, right? If it's biased to the left, then maybe it's a good thing, right? That when you reflect on the last 4 years, certainly there's less civility and the tone has gotten harsher. But if those who have the power to define that common view that we all share define it, maybe it's a feature, not a bug, that legitimacy has been stripped.
Well, I think there's a lot to that. We certainly don't want to defer to anybody else to define what is right or true, because you do have that potential for extreme bias. And we do know that historically, not just in our country, but throughout world history, when one group gets to decide what is true and right, it is a problem for almost everybody else. So I think it has been a very good thing to have more diverse media outlets. I do think it is good that you can get all kinds of views and hear I think it's really good that we have a system right now today that is letting a lot of people say, I don't think Donald Trump lost this election. It's not because whether I endorse their views or not, it is good to let that be aired and to let people explore those things. What our challenge is and what is new is how do we take that mass of information and begin to find something of common ground in it? How do we begin to build support for the idea that it's good to have these different opinions?
Roseanne, I see you unmuted. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. So earlier you said only about, I think, 30% of people discuss politics on a day-to-day basis.
13.
Oh my gosh, okay, even lower than I thought. Has that changed over time? Anytime I talk about politics with people who have differing views, they're always surprised at my positions because of which side I align with. So my thought initially is we should be having more conversation. So are we having less and that's what's impacting? Are we seeing that in the polling, or is it not it's not impacting anything.
No, during this past week, there's obviously been more talk about politics because there was a big national election. But this has been true for a very long time. I did my first polls in the 1980s, so I can't really speak to much before that. But there's nothing in the data that I've ever seen that showed most people got up and were excited to talk about politics on a day in and day out basis. They might talk about their favorite baseball team or something else, but it's not the most important thing in life for most people. Now, that doesn't mean they don't feel a civic obligation to spend some time participating in it. But it's more, there's a time for politics. I got to pay attention, see who the candidates are a few weeks before the election. And then there's a time for the rest of it. And by the way, one of the, I'll get a plug in for Ballotpedia here. One of the things that Ballotpedia does really well is they present information for people who don't live and breathe politics. It is one of the only political sites out there that has roughly proportional representation from Republicans, Democrats, and independents. It's not slanted one way or the other. Now, most of the year, most people would say it's pretty dry and boring information. But in the 6 weeks leading up to an election, more than 1 out of 4 voters go to Ballotpedia to find information. Many of them are looking for information on a ballot initiative or a specific candidate or something else. So people are seeking out the information, but about 80% of that traffic comes in the last 2 months of a 2-year cycle. And by the way, I should say the other part of it is, when they go home for Thanksgiving, the last thing they want to do is talk politics. They want to do something else.
Yeah, I will say I'm probably one of the few people that when there's not an election, I'm still on Ballotpedia because I'll wake up and be like, what was the vote total in the Houston City Council district election? And that's the only place you can find it easily. So.
Actually, and just to give you a really bizarre take on it too, I ran into someone a couple of years ago at a meeting, and she said, "Oh, I love Ballotpedia. We have a pot party and look at it every year." I said, "What?" And she said, "It's the only place that gives full and unbiased coverage of all the marijuana initiatives. So we get together and celebrate whenever something." And I was like, okay, that's not the use I first thought of for Ballotpedia, but it's a good use.
You guys have a large audience.
Yeah. Well, and look, I think the issue here is most Americans, they have things that are really important in their life, family and faith. They are worrying about their jobs and what's happening. They embrace freedom, and to that they support the idea of limiting government. They don't want to have to bother with it every day. They also support the idea of limiting corporate power. They're trying to figure out a way to carve out a place where they can live their own life. Now, that doesn't mean rugged individualism and let's go off to the mountains and not see anybody, but it means finding a place where they can decide how to work together with their friends and neighbors and community. And that's the challenge. That's the positive thing we can focus them on. And the challenge needs to be, how do we detoxify the political environment to allow safe space for that? What I believe the answer is, and this is not going to be a good answer or a happy answer, I guess. America has been going through a huge change. I talk about it in my last book. I call this the Great Turnaround. From the beginning of America up till the 1970s, everything in our society was getting bigger and more centralized and more homogenized. We went from town criers to those 3 networks with 94% of the primetime audience. In the 1970s, we had cable TV, we had the microprocessor and Apple and Microsoft. American society began to decentralize, but our political system continued to centralize. So we now have a very centralized political system overseeing a very decentralized society, and that's an unsustainable connection. It is going to blow up. And when we have transitions in America, things get worse before they get better. I believe, and I said this before the election, no matter who would win, the next 4 or 5 years are going to be very bumpy as we go through this transition. Joe Biden and Donald Trump, whatever you may think of them, they were not the youthful leaders to help us get adjusted to this new digital era. So we're going to have this bumpy path. and then things will realign. We've had these moments in the past. Ronald Reagan helped provide a transition in the 1980s, and we had the New Deal in the 1930s. And I don't know what the new alignment is going to look like, but until we go through this passage, until we get through this and find some common ground in politics, it's going to be ugly.
So Melinda Jackson asked a question over here in the chat, and it says, do you think there are really very many undecided voters? Feels that the U.S. is very polarized. Similarly, are you concerned about the polarization in the media?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that question.
So she said, do you think there are really very many undecided voters? It feels as though the U.S. is very polarized. And similarly, are you concerned about the polarization in the media?
Okay, yes, I am concerned about polarization in the media. Not so much the media has bias and you want them to pretend to be pure, but there should at least be acknowledgement of other sides. There should be acknowledgement. It's really frustrating as a pollster to have data that shows both sides are a little bit wrong, both sides are a little bit right. And depending on which outlet you're on, they only emphasize one side of it. So that is a real concern. Mark Penn did a study a while ago and showed that he took a number of absolutely true and verifiable statements and found that not one of them did a majority of Americans believe was true. People who watch Fox News believe some were true. People who watch CNN believe some were true. So that's where you are. Now, in terms of voters, about 85% of voters already know who they're going to vote for in 2024. They're a party base that has been very stable for a very long time. Then you've got another 6, 8, 10% who kind of lean one way, but could change their mind depending on who the nominee is. There were probably some Democrats who would not have been on board if Bernie Sanders had been the nominee, but they were okay with Biden. And then you've only got a few percent who are truly undecided or uncommitted. But I think what that overlooks is there is an intensity difference. There's a small group of people, don't know how big it is, it shifts a little bit, and it's bigger at election time, but there's a small segment of society that the election is America. If this doesn't turn out right, our country is done. There's another group of people who say it's important, but will survive somehow, or at least make do. And then there's, again, about a quarter of the public that doesn't put a lot doesn't see a lot of impact. The political process is something outside. So it's not that they're undecided. It's, I guess I'll vote for this person, but I don't feel strongly about it.
So I want to, Daniel asked an interesting question before about the left defining, terminology and definitions for things. And how do you get away from that? Is that largely a cultural problem because we've allowed the culture to kind of set that definition? And I also kind of want to tie in what you said about Ballotpedia presenting information in a way that someone who doesn't, digest politics every day can understand. Is that a better way of going about it, since most people don't speak about politics all the time, just kind of talking about it in a way that the average person would, or kind of what do you see the solution there?
So what I love about Ballotpedia is the presentation is good. If you were looking for data 3 weeks before the election, you can go and find it. And you can find it in a source that looks credible, that says good and bad things about both candidates or both, whatever it might be. That's a really positive contribution. What Ballotpedia does not address is the culture that defines these things. And when I say the culture defines it, well, Ballotpedia can't impact that because Ballotpedia is kind of boring and dry by cultural standards. So what that needs to be is there needs to be cultural pushback or cultural dialogue about what does terminology mean. Look, the way I would describe it, if I was thinking about, if you want to have a positive impact on the American culture and society and how it ties into the political world, and this happens to be a project I'm dipping my toe into right now, so it's fresh in my mind, but you want to go and you want to find out, what do people right now believe that freedom equality, self-governance, democracy, community. What do those terms mean to people today? And then you want to say, what would they mean in an ideal society? What do we think they should mean, or how would you redefine that? And I would do the same with key issues. And then the question is, how do you connect the dot from where we are today to where we're not? I spoke to a conservative in Washington a couple days ago, and who was saying, you know, how come all the polls say Americans love freedom, but they still vote for Democrats? And I laughed. I said, you know, because you just assume that freedom is something that only Republicans fight for. Actually, when we ask voters which party is more committed to freedom, they're split right down the middle. They have different definitions of what freedom means. So we need to get to these words, and we need to engage in the culture. The way that I would put it is, I believe deeply in America's founding ideals. I believe they were obviously not adhered to or lived up to for a long time, and will never be there perfectly, but they are noble ideals. And we need to find ways to promote those ideals in the popular culture. And we need to explain why it's good to have a system of checks and balances that slows things down, rather than having the government do whatever the popular whim of the moment is. But we need to do that to people that are living in the 21st century. We need to do that to people who are used to clicking and buying, because what do you mean it's going to take 30 minutes to drive to a store to buy something? I can't do that. We need to take the culture where it is, understand what they mean, and what the broad culture means, and then begin to try and influence it. And that is not an easy task. It is an ongoing challenge. It involves civic education. It involves all kinds of activities. And it involves sometimes people saying things that, or agreeing to things that I don't like the outcome of, but the process is right here, or this is something that you have to look at the principle. A great role model, you know, after the Boston Massacre in 1770, which was probably instigated by Sam Adams, and, you know, a couple of British soldiers were put on trial in Boston, and John Adams, who went on to become our second president, became the defense attorney for the British soldiers. Not really a popular move in Boston at that time, but a great example of the way somebody should behave. His job was to make sure they had a fair defense.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great note to leave off on. This was a fantastic discussion. I appreciate you so much for taking the time to just spend an hour with us, and, you know, lending us, you know, your voice, and you know, hearing our concerns. I want to give Wendy a chance to say something. I don't know if she has anything to add.
Hi, I'm just looking at the calendar. We skipped July, August, and December. And so we will be excited to see you on the second Wednesday in January, which looks to be the 13th. Does that look right? Have a great holiday season. And please, right after this, go, if you're not getting our emails, please go and rectify that. Call me, call Kate, Annie, or Charles, any of us that you know how to get in touch with. And we will make sure that you get back on the list if your system kicked us out. And we'll probably also be sending another survey to see what subject you want to explore next. And we hope to not be virtual, but we'll play it as it lies. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again, Scott. We really appreciate you taking the time out, and thank you everyone for joining us. Any more questions you have, feel free to email them to any of us, and we can get them over to Scott and hopefully get you some answers for them. So thanks, everybody. We promise to have you out by 1, and it's right at 1. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Annie and Kate.